She didn't see the car until it was already too late to matter. Rain blurred the streetlights into smears of gold. Her lungs burned. And somewhere behind her, footsteps she couldn't outrun kept closing the gap. Then headlights. Then impact. Then silence. Nika Blake had been running for exactly 11 minutes when her hip caught the front bumper of a black sedan and sent her stumbling into a puddle on a side street in Seoul. She wasn't running from a stranger. She was running from the father of her son, a man who used to whisper, "I love you," the same way he used to slam doors. Before we go further, besties, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. If you believe love should never come with fear attached, hit that like button right now, and if you want to see how far Nika has to go before she's finally safe, subscribe, because this story is about to get very real, very fast. 3 months earlier, Nika sat across from Chris in their kitchen in Atlanta, watching him smile the way he always smiled before things got bad. He had a way of making a room feel smaller, of standing just close enough that leaving felt like an argument nobody wanted to start. She had learned to read the air before he even opened his mouth. That night, the air had been wrong. She didn't leave because of one incident. She left because she counted. She counted the number of times he checked her phone. She counted the number of times he told her she was too sensitive. She counted the number of times their son, only 4 years old, flinched at raised voices that weren't even his to be scared of. When the counting became a full-time job, she made a decision that took her 17 minutes to plan and 3 years to work up the courage for. She left her son with her mother in Atlanta, promising she'd send for him the second she was stable, and she bought a one-way ticket to Seoul with money she'd been quietly saving in an account Chris didn't know existed. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself a lot of things that week. Now, back in the present, on that wet Seoul street, a man was climbing out of the car that had just clipped her, and he looked more frightened than she felt. "You're bleeding," he said, in English carved carefully out of a language that wasn't his first. His voice didn't have the practiced calm of a man used to accidents. It had the raw shake of someone who'd just done something he couldn't undo. Nika looked down. Her knee had torn through her jeans, a thin line of blood mixing with rain. She'd had worse. She'd had much worse, and from someone who claimed to love her. "I'm fine," she said, already trying to stand, already trying to look past him for any sign that the footsteps behind her had followed her into this street too. "You're not fine. I'm taking you to a hospital." "No." The word came out sharper than she meant, sharper than a stranger deserved. But hospitals meant records, and records meant a trail. And a trail meant Chris's cousin, who worked administrative intake at half the hospitals in whatever city she landed in, could find her in a single afternoon. "You don't understand what a hospital means for me right now." He studied her for a second too long. Most men would have argued. Most men would have insisted, made it about their own guilt, their own need to fix what they'd broken. He didn't. He just looked at her like he was recalculating something, like her fear had just told him more than her words had. "Okay," he said slowly. "No hospital. But you're not standing in the rain either." His name was Bong Jae-young, though she wouldn't learn that for another 20 minutes, sitting across from him in a noodle shop 3 blocks away that smelled like broth and garlic and safety, 2 things she hadn't associated with each other in years. He didn't ask her name right away. He ordered 2 bowls without checking if she liked spice, then apologized and asked if she wanted his instead, which made her laugh despite herself, a short, surprised sound that seemed to catch him off guard too. "You always this jumpy after hitting people with your car?" she asked, arching an eyebrow, testing whether he could take a joke about the thing that had just happened. "You always run through traffic like it owes you money?" he shot back, and something in his tone told her he wasn't going to tiptoe around her, which, strangely, made her trust him a little more. She told him her name was Nika. She didn't tell him why she was running. He didn't ask twice. What she didn't know yet was that 3 floors above the noodle shop, in an apartment she would move into a week later out of what felt like pure convenience, a man halfway across the world was already typing her name into a search engine, connecting dots she hadn't realized existed, preparing to sell information about her location to someone she thought she'd left 4,000 miles behind. The apartment Jae-young offered her wasn't out of some grand romantic gesture. That's what he told her, at least, sitting stiffly on the edge of a leather chair while she stood by the window of a unit 3 floors above the restaurant they'd just eaten in. "I own the building," he said. "1 unit's empty. You stay a week, figure out your next move. No strings." "No strings," she repeated, unconvinced. That's what men say right before the strings show up. He almost smiled at that. Almost. I'm not most men. Everybody says that too. She took the apartment anyway, because the alternative was a hostel with thin walls and thinner locks, and because something about the way he'd refused to push her into a hospital, refused to demand her full story, told her he understood boundaries in a way Chris never had. The first 2 weeks blurred into a rhythm neither of them planned. She found a small English tutoring gig through a bulletin board at a language center, teaching conversational English to businessmen who wanted to sound less stiff on international calls. She used a shortened version of her name at work, dropped her last name entirely, paid in cash where she could. Old habits from a life spent disappearing. Jae Young, meanwhile, kept finding reasons to check on the property. He'd show up with grocery bags he didn't need to buy, claiming the building needed inspecting, then linger in her doorway asking questions about her day that had nothing to do with plumbing or electricity. "You're a bad liar," she told him one evening, watching him set down a bag of vegetables neither of them would cook that week. "I'm an excellent liar," he said. "I'm choosing not to lie to you." That kind of honesty unsettled her more than any smooth line could have. She wasn't used to men who said exactly what they meant. Chris had been fluent in half-truths, soft words wrapped around hard control. Jae Young spoke like every sentence cost him something to say, which somehow made her trust every sentence more. Their conversations stretched longer each visit. She learned he ran his family's holdings, though he rarely talked about work, steering conversations instead toward smaller things. The way she mispronounced certain Korean words on purpose to make him laugh, the way he genuinely didn't understand half her American slang and used it wrong in ways that cracked her up. "I told my assistant she was the goat today," he admitted one night, dead serious. "She looked at me like I'd insulted her family." Nika doubled over laughing, the kind of laugh that came from somewhere she thought Chris had shut down permanently. "That means she's the best, not an actual goat. Oh my God, please tell me you explained." "I did not. I let her think I'd lost my mind. It felt safer." Somewhere in the third week, between the jokes and the shared bowls of food and the late-night conversations that drifted from small talk into things that mattered, she started telling him pieces of the truth. Not everything. Not yet, but enough. She told him she had a son back in Atlanta, 4 years old, staying with her mother. She told him leaving had been the hardest and easiest decision of her life at the same time. That guilt sat in her chest every single morning like a stone she couldn't put down. She didn't cry when she told him. She'd used up all her tears months before boarding that plane. Jae Young listened without interrupting, without offering the kind of hollow comfort people give when they don't know what else to say. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "My fiancé," he said eventually, the word landing heavy in the room. "She was in something similar once. Before me. I didn't know until it was almost too late." Nika's chest tightened. "Almost? I got her out, but not soon enough to stop what it did to her." He didn't elaborate further that night, and she didn't push. She recognized the shape of a wound that wasn't ready to be touched, because she carried a few of those herself. It was during that same week that the first crack appeared, small and easy to miss if she hadn't been trained by years of vigilance to notice everything. One of her students at the tutoring center mentioned, in passing, that a man had come by asking questions about her, specifically about her schedule, whether she lived alone, whether she'd mentioned family back home. The student assumed it was a friend checking in. Nika assumed, for one relieved second, that it was Jae Young being overly protective again. It wasn't. When she confronted him about it that night, voice tight with a fury she hadn't expected to feel toward him, he looked genuinely blindsided. "I didn't send anyone," he said. "Nika, I swear to you, I have never had anyone follow you." The look on his face wasn't guilt. It was fear. The specific kind of fear that comes from realizing a threat you didn't know existed just revealed itself in your own backyard. They sat at his kitchen table until almost 3 in the morning, laptop open between them, going through the building's delivery camera footage frame by frame, like two people trying to solve a puzzle neither of them had asked to be handed. "There," Nika said, pointing at a grainy figure who dropped off a package to the wrong floor twice in 1 week, always lingering a few extra seconds by the directory board. "That's him. That's the man from the tutoring center." Jae Young zoomed in, jaw tight. "That's not a courier uniform. Look at the shoes." She hadn't noticed the shoes. Chris always noticed things like that. Expensive things trying to pass as ordinary. It made her stomach turn that she recognized the tell, even in a stranger. They didn't call the police. Calling the police meant paperwork, meant a name on a report, meant possibly alerting the very person she was hiding from that she had a fixed address worth investigating. Instead, they did what two resourceful, stubborn people do when institutions feel more dangerous than helpful. They dug. Jae Young had a contact who managed building security systems across the city, someone he trusted enough to ask a favor without asking why. Nika, meanwhile, sat with her own memory, replaying every name Chris had ever mentioned, every cousin, every friend of a friend who worked in information services, a phrase he used like it meant nothing. By the following evening, they had a face pulled from 3 separate camera angles and, through Jae Young's contact, a name attached to a private investigation license registered out of Georgia. "He's American," Jae Young said, reading the details off his phone. "Licensed investigator. Contracted for the past month." Nika's hands had gone cold. Contracted by who? That question took 2 more days to answer, and when it did, it broke something in her that she hadn't expected to break. It wasn't Chris who hired the investigator. It was Denise. Denise, her cousin, the one person Nika called every single week without fail since she'd left. The one who sent pictures of her son at the park, who told her she was proud of her for finally getting out, who Nika trusted with the actual city she was staying in, the actual name of the building, the actual name Jae Young went by. Nika stared at the screen until the letters stopped making sense. She wouldn't. She's not like that. She's the one person who never once took his side. But the paper trail didn't lie. Denise had paid the investigator's retainer fee from an account with her own name on it. When Nika finally got Denise on the phone, her voice was shaking with a fury that had nowhere safe to land. "Why do you have a private investigator following me?" There was a long pause on the other end, long enough that Nika almost hung up out of pure impatience. When Denise spoke, her voice cracked in a way that told Nika this wasn't calculated malice. It was something worse. It was manipulation dressed up as love. "Chris came to me," Denise admitted. "He said you were having some kind of breakdown. He said you weren't thinking straight, that you left your son behind out of nowhere, that he was worried sick and just wanted to make sure you were safe. He showed me messages, Nika. Messages that looked like you were spiraling. I thought I was helping bring you home. You hired someone to track me down for him. I didn't know it was for him. Not exactly, I thought." Denise's voice broke fully now. "He's good at making things sound reasonable. You know that better than anyone." Nika did know that. She knew it better than anyone alive. And that was exactly what made this so devastating. It wasn't a stranger's betrayal. It was proof that Chris's manipulation had a reach long enough to turn her own blood against her without either of them fully realizing what was happening. She hung up without saying goodbye, sat on the edge of the bed in the apartment that had started to feel like the first safe place she'd had in years, and let herself cry for the first time since she'd landed in Seoul. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet, exhausted tears that came from carrying something alone for far too long. Jae Young didn't try to fix it with words. He sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him without him reaching for her, and let the silence hold whatever she needed it to hold. "I keep thinking I'm being paranoid," she finally said, "and then I find out I wasn't paranoid enough." "You're not paranoid," he said quietly. "You're someone who learned to survive a person most people never had to survive. That's not the same thing." She looked at him then, really looked, and something in her chest shifted, quiet and terrifying and real. She wasn't ready to name it yet, but it was there. What neither of them knew was that 4,000 miles away, Chris had already booked a flight to Seoul, using information Denise never meant to hand him directly but had, piece by piece, without realizing it. He wasn't coming to apologize. "My loves, I want to know something from you watching right now. Have you ever had someone you trusted completely turn out to be the reason your secret didn't stay a secret? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and if this story has you gripped already, smash that like button and subscribe, because it's about to get a lot more intense." 2 weeks passed in a strange, suspended quiet after the discovery about Denise. Nika kept teaching, kept her routine, kept telling herself the investigator had likely reported back and disappeared once he'd confirmed her location. That whatever information Chris now had, he'd stay 4,000 miles away and let it rot into nothing, the way most of his threats eventually did. She should have known better. Chris didn't do nothing. Chris did calculated. During those 2 weeks, her relationship with Jae Young deepened in ways neither of them announced out loud. There was no dramatic declaration, No single moment they could point to and say, that's when it changed. It changed in small increments. The way he started keeping her favorite tea at his place without being asked. The way she stopped flinching when he reached to help her with something. The way conversations that used to end with polite goodnights started stretching until one of them fell asleep mid-sentence on the couch. One evening, after a full day of teaching that left her drained in the particular way only pretending to be fine all day could leave a person, she showed up at his door without calling first, something she'd never done before. "Bad day?" he asked, stepping aside to let her in without needing further explanation. "Bad decade," she said, dropping onto his couch like the weight of gravity had doubled. "One of my students asked why I don't smile as much as I used to. I've known him 3 weeks. I've known myself 29 years, and I couldn't answer that question." Jae-young sat beside her, not too close, giving her the space she always needed before she'd let anyone closer. "What would you have said if you were being honest?" She thought about it for a long moment. That smiling used to be a warning sign. If I smiled too much, it meant something bad was about to happen, because that's when he'd say I was too happy without him, like my joy was something I owed to his approval. Her voice was steady, matter of fact, the kind of steady that only comes after years of practice turning pain into information instead of tears. "So I learned to keep my face flat, safer that way." Jae-young was quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't empty, but full of something he was carefully choosing not to rush. "And now I laugh at your terrible English slang and forget to feel guilty about it for a whole 5 minutes, she said, a small, real smile tugging at her mouth despite everything. "Only a whole 5 minutes? Don't push your luck." He smiled too, the kind of smile that reached all the way to his eyes, and for a moment the room felt like it belonged only to the two of them, untouched by Atlanta, by investigators, by anyone waiting on the other side of an ocean to disrupt it. That night, she told him more about her son. His name was Ronnie. He had her exact laugh, according to her mother. Loud and sudden and a little too big for a room. He liked dinosaurs and hated bath time, and had started asking, over video calls, when Mommy was coming home, a question that carved something new and raw into her chest, every single time. "I didn't choose to leave him," she said, voice thick. "I chose to leave the version of our life that was slowly breaking both of us. There's a difference, but it doesn't feel like one most days." Jae-young reached over and, for the first time since she'd known him, took her hand, not pulling her closer, just holding it, steady and warm. "It's not a small thing what you did. Most people don't survive leaving. You did, and you're still fighting to get him back the right way instead of the fast way. That's not weakness. That's the hardest kind of strength there is." She let herself lean into that, just for a moment, let herself believe someone could see the whole weight of what she carried, and not flinch away from it. The peace didn't last. 3 days later, while she was mid-lesson at the tutoring center, correcting a businessman's pronunciation of a phrase he kept saying wrong on purpose, just to make her laugh, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown Korean number. It was a photo of her, taken from across the street outside the center, time-stamped less than 10 minutes earlier. Underneath it, a single line of text in English. "Found you. Let's talk about our son." Her hands shook so badly she had to set the phone face down on the desk, apologize to her confused student, and excuse herself to the small break room where she gripped the edge of a counter and tried to remember how to breathe. Chris wasn't threatening from a distance anymore. He was here, in Seoul, close enough to photograph her without her noticing. She called Jae-young before she called anyone else, and something about that instinct, reaching for him first instead of trying to handle it entirely alone the way she'd trained herself to do for years, wasn't lost on her even in the middle of panic. He arrived at the tutoring center faster than should have been physically possible, cutting through traffic in a way that told her he hadn't stopped to think twice. "Show me," he said, and she handed him the phone, watching his jaw tighten as he read the message. "He's not hiding," Jae-young said slowly. "He wants you to know he's here. That's not a man planning to disappear quietly." "I know how he operates," Nika said, forcing her voice steady even as her stomach twisted. "This isn't the scary part yet. The scary part is when he pretends to be reasonable." She was right. 2 days later, Chris didn't ambush her in an alley or corner her outside her apartment. He walked directly into the tutoring center during her lesson, dressed sharp, smiling wide, playing the part of a concerned father with an ease that made her sick. "Nika," he said, voice warm, carrying just enough volume for the room to hear, I flew all this way because I miss our son asking about his mother. Can we just talk, like adults? Every head in the room turned. Her coworkers, students she'd built rapport with over weeks, all watching a man who looked calm, reasonable, wounded even, standing across from a woman who suddenly looked, to anyone without context, unreasonably cold. This was the twist that hurt worse than any physical threat could have. Abusers rarely look like monsters in daylight, in public, in front of witnesses. They look like victims. And in that moment, Nika watched the room's sympathy quietly shift away from her without a single person understanding why. She didn't yell, she didn't cry, she didn't give him the reaction he'd flown across the world to provoke. "We can talk," she said evenly, "in a public place, with a lawyer present, through the proper channels, the way any reasonable co-parent would prefer, if that's really what this is about." His smile flickered, just barely, just enough for her to catch it because she'd spent years learning to read every flicker on that face. "You're really going to make this difficult? In front of all these people?" "I'm not making anything difficult. I'm making it correct." She kept her voice level, pulled her phone from her pocket with hands that only shook slightly, and pressed record without breaking eye contact with him. "Say whatever you flew here to say. I'm listening." His whole demeanor shifted the second the recording started, the charm dimming just enough for a flicker of the man she actually knew to show through. "Turn that off." "No. Nika, you wanted to talk. Talk." Her voice never rose, never cracked. And something in her own steadiness surprised even her. She wasn't the frightened woman sprinting through rain-soaked streets anymore. She was still afraid, that hadn't disappeared, but the fear no longer controlled her hands. Chris, realizing the room was now fully watching him, realizing the recording meant anything he said could be used later, backed off, muttering something about needing space to talk without an audience, and left the center without another word, the charm evaporating the second he stepped outside the door. Jae-young arrived less than 3 minutes later, security having called him the instant the situation began, sprinting in from across the building he happened to be visiting that day. Too late to intervene, but exactly on time to see her standing there, shaken but unbroken, having handled it entirely on her own. "You didn't need me," he said quietly, something between relief and awe in his voice. "I needed you to trust I could handle it," she said. "You did. That matters more than showing up in time to fight him for me." That night, sitting in his apartment replaying the recording for the 10th time, dissecting every word Chris had said for anything useful, Nika felt something shift permanently inside her. She wasn't running anymore. She was standing, finally, on ground she'd built herself. But Chris hadn't flown across the world for a custody conversation at all. And the real reason would come out 2 days later, aimed not at her, but at the one person standing beside her. The call came to Jae-young's private line, a number he'd had for over a decade, one that almost nobody outside his closest circle possessed. Chris had gotten it from Denise, who'd handed it over weeks earlier without realizing what it would eventually be used for, back when she still believed she was helping. "I know who you are," Chris said, voice smooth, businesslike, nothing like the wounded father act from the tutoring center. "Rich Korean guy shacking up with my baby mama. Cute story, real cute. What do you want?" Jae-young said flatly, already recording the call on a second device out of instinct. "I want this to be simple. You pay me to disappear, quietly, no drama, and I go back to Atlanta and let the custody thing play out on paper. Easy, boring. Or," Chris continued, "I make sure every judge in Georgia hears about how Nika abandoned her son to run off with a rich stranger overseas. Doesn't matter what's true. Matters what it looks like. And trust me, it'll look bad for her." Jae-young's hand tightened around the phone, jaw locked so hard it ached. "You're threatening to lie about her in a custody case to extort money from me. I'm offering you a clean, quiet solution," Chris said, unbothered. "Your choice how messy you want it to get." Jae-young hung up without another word, sat in silence for a long moment, and then did something that surprised even himself. He didn't call his lawyers. He didn't call security. He called Nika. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not panic before I finish," he said, and then told her everything, word for word, the threat, the extortion, the ugly reality that Chris hadn't come to Seoul for their son at all. She listened in silence, and when he finished, her voice came out steadier than he expected. Of course this is what it's about. It was never about Ronnie, it's about control. And when he can't control me directly, he tries to control what people think of me instead. I'm not paying him, Jae-young said. It's not because of money, because paying him means he wins, means this becomes something he can repeat forever. I know, Nika said. I wasn't going to let you pay him either. There was a beat of silence, something unspoken passing between them, a decision forming without either of them fully voicing it yet. I want to go back, Nika said finally, to Atlanta, face this directly, in front of a judge, on record, instead of running from it in Seoul. I'm tired of him controlling the narrative from a distance. Then we go together, Jae-young said simply. No hesitation, no calculation, just certainty. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I'm choosing to. 3 days later, they boarded a flight to Atlanta. Nika's stomach twisted with a complicated mix of fear and something close to hope. A feeling she hadn't let herself trust in a long time. Landing back in the city she'd fled from months earlier felt like stepping into an old photograph that had changed just slightly, the way home always does after you've been gone long enough to become someone new. Her mother met them at the airport, eyes red before she even said a word, pulling Nika into an embrace that held every ounce of worry she'd carried for months. You look different, her mother said, studying her daughter's face like she was searching for confirmation of something. Steadier. I feel different, Nika admitted. Ronnie was waiting at the house, and the moment he saw her, he barreled across the living room and crashed into her legs with the force only a 4-year-old fully committed to a hug can produce. Nika sank to the floor, wrapping around him, breathing him in, feeling months of guilt and distance collapse into a single overwhelming wave of relief. You came back, he said into her shoulder, small voice muffled. I told you I would, she whispered, throat tight. I promised. Jae-young stood a respectful distance away, watching the reunion with an expression Nika would later describe as the softest she'd ever seen on him, something unguarded finally slipping through. But the reunion was brief comfort before the real fight began. Chris had already filed paperwork requesting an emergency custody hearing, painting Nika, in official documents, as an unstable flight risk who'd abandoned her child without warning. The hearing was set for 4 days later, and buried in Jae-young's own quiet research, something surfaced that neither of them expected, something that would change everything about how the hearing would go. Real quick before we keep going, because this next part is a lot. If you've made it this far, you already know Nika didn't have it easy, and I want to know, do you think Chris actually believes his own lies at this point, or does he know exactly what he's doing? Tell me in the comments, and if you haven't yet, hit subscribe so you're here for more stories like this one. The information came from a record search Jae-young had quietly commissioned days earlier, not out of manipulation, not out of business instinct, just simple public documentation nobody had thought to check because Chris had always been careful to keep his past clean-looking on the surface. A restraining order, filed 4 years before Nika had even met him, by a woman named Alicia, someone Nika vaguely remembered him mentioning once, dismissively, as an ex who couldn't handle a real relationship. The order had been filed after an incident eerily similar to patterns Nika knew intimately: control, isolation. An escalation that had ended with police involvement and a judge's signature on paper Chris had somehow kept out of every conversation since. He told me she was crazy, Nika said quietly, staring at the document on Jae-young's laptop screen, hands trembling slightly. He told me she stalked him after they broke up. He's been telling the same story with different names for a long time, Jae-young said gently. You weren't the first version of this. You might not have been the last, if you'd stayed. The revelation didn't erase the pain, didn't undo months of gaslighting or years of shrinking herself to keep peace in a home that never offered any, but it did something else, something almost as powerful. It confirmed, in black and white legal record, that she hadn't imagined any of it, that the fear had always been reasonable, that leaving hadn't been an overreaction, it had been survival, just like it had been for a woman years before her who'd tried to warn the world in the only way the system allowed. The hearing arrived with a tension that sat in Nika's chest like a stone she couldn't swallow past. She dressed carefully that morning, not for Chris, not for the judge's approval of her appearance, but for herself, for the version of her that needed to walk into that room looking like exactly who she was, a woman who had survived, not one who was falling apart. Chris arrived with a lawyer and a rehearsed narrative, painting a picture of a devoted father, abandoned by an erratic mother who'd fled the country without warning. He spoke smoothly, convincingly, the same charm that had worked on Denise, on strangers at the tutoring center, on Nika herself for years before she learned to see past it. When it was her turn, Nika didn't raise her voice, didn't cry, didn't perform desperation for sympathy. She laid out the timeline plainly, the pattern of control that predated her decision to leave, the safety plan she'd carefully built rather than a reckless disappearance, the calls she'd maintained with her son every single week without exception, the job she'd secured, the stable home she'd created even while displaced. Her lawyer entered the restraining order from years earlier into evidence, a document that reframed everything Chris had said about his own history. His composure cracked for the first time in the entire hearing, a flash of the man underneath the charm slipping through in front of a judge who noticed everything. Denise testified too, something Nika hadn't expected, but that meant more than she could put into words, describing honestly how Chris had manipulated her into believing Nika was unstable, how she'd unknowingly funded the investigator that ultimately led him overseas. It wasn't a clean redemption. Nika still felt the sting of that betrayal sitting somewhere in her chest. But it was honesty, offered without excuse, and that counted for something. The judge's ruling didn't erase every complication in an instant. Family court rarely works that cleanly, but it granted Nika primary custody with clearly defined, supervised terms for Chris's involvement, a legal boundary that finally existed on paper, enforceable, undeniable. Walking out of that courthouse with Ronnie's small hand in hers, Nika felt something she hadn't let herself feel in longer than she could remember. Safety that didn't depend on running. Jae Young was waiting outside, leaning against a car, not saying anything, just watching her walk toward him with an expression that held more relief than words could carry. "It's done," she said, voice shaking slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline finally leaving her body. "It's done," he echoed. "For now. For the important part." Ronnie, unbothered by the weight of the day, tugged on Jae Young's sleeve. "Are you my mom's friend?" Jae Young crouched down to his eye level, something gentle crossing his face. "I'm hoping to be a lot more than that, if your mom will let me." Ronnie considered this with the serious focus only a 4-year-old could bring to such a question. "Do you like dinosaurs?" "I know nothing about dinosaurs," Jae Young admitted. "That's okay," Ronnie said generously. "I'll teach you." Nika laughed, the sound surprising even herself, full and unguarded in a way it hadn't been in years. But peace she was learning rarely arrived without one final test, and Denise's next confession, delivered quietly that same evening, would reveal a detail about Chris's plans that none of them had accounted for. They were sitting in her mother's kitchen that evening, the smell of dinner still lingering in the air. Ronnie finally asleep upstairs after a day that had exhausted everyone, when Denise showed up at the door, eyes swollen from crying, hands shaking as she asked to speak with Nika alone. Nika almost said no, almost let the wound of betrayal keep the door closed. But something in Denise's face, something desperate and afraid, told her this wasn't just another apology. He knows the ruling didn't go his way. And Nika, before I left his place last week, I heard him on the phone with someone, talking about not giving up that easy, about how supervised visitation isn't over yet. I didn't think anything of it until today. I think he's planning something. Nika's stomach dropped. Planning what exactly? I don't know, but he wasn't talking like a man who accepts losing. Denise's voice cracked. I know I don't deserve your trust right now. I know what I did, but I couldn't sit on this and let something happen to you or Ronnie because I was too ashamed to speak up again. Nika sat with that information for a long moment, the fragile piece of the day cracking under the weight of a threat that hadn't fully revealed itself yet. Whatever gratitude she felt toward Denise for the warning tangled uncomfortably with the exhaustion of once again having to brace for Chris's next move. She called Jae Young immediately, relaying what Denise had said, watching his expression shift from calm to alert in real time. Supervised visitation means he still has scheduled contact with Ronnie, Jae Young said slowly, thinking it through. If he's not planning to accept the ruling, that's his access point. The next morning, the supervised visitation coordinator called with unexpected news. Chris had missed his scheduled check-in, the first requirement of the court-ordered arrangement, without explanation or contact. By that afternoon, it became clear why. Chris hadn't gone home. He hadn't gone anywhere near the supervised visitation center. Instead, security footage later confirmed he'd driven to Ronnie's daycare, the same one Nika had kept confidential for months, specifically to protect against exactly this scenario, using information Denise had unknowingly leaked to him weeks earlier before any of them realized how deep his access had gone. The daycare, per its policy, refused to release Ronnie to a parent whose custody status had just been legally restricted. A small, bureaucratic safeguard that became the only thing standing between Chris and taking their son without anyone's knowledge. Nika got the call while sitting in Jae-young's rented car outside her mother's house, and the world seemed to tilt sideways the second she heard the daycare director's voice explaining what had happened, what had almost happened, what the responding officer had noted in his report before Chris left the premises without incident, but not without a clear, chilling message to the staff that he wasn't going to just accept losing his son over some paperwork. He tried to take him, Nika said, voice hollow with a fear that felt different from every fear she'd carried before, sharper, more immediate. He actually tried. Jae-young was already driving before she finished the sentence, knuckles white against the steering wheel, jaw set in a way she'd never seen on him before. They arrived to find Ronnie safe, confused but unharmed, sitting with a staff member who'd kept him calmly occupied with crayons, while the situation unfolded around him without his understanding of the stakes. Nika scooped him up, holding him so tightly he squirmed, pressing her face into his hair and letting the relief crash through her in waves she couldn't fully control. "Mommy, you're squishing me," he mumbled, and despite everything, she let out a broken laugh against his hair. The attempted pickup, documented by daycare staff and confirmed by police report, became the final piece that shattered whatever remaining leverage Chris had left in the custody case. An emergency modification hearing was filed within 24 hours, and this time, there was no ambiguity left for a judge to weigh, no charm offensive that could undo a documented attempt to remove a child in direct violation of a court order. But somewhere in the chaos of the following days, as lawyers filed motions and police searched for Chris, who had vanished from every address and contact number they had for him, Nika realized the fight wasn't fully over. A man who had just proven he wouldn't respect legal boundaries wasn't a man who would simply disappear quietly into the background of her life. And late that night, long after Ronnie had finally fallen asleep between her and her mother, curled up like he refused to let go of either of them, Nika's phone buzzed one final time with a message that made her blood run cold. The message was short. No threats, no dramatic language, nothing that would hold up as evidence in any court. Just 4 words. "This isn't over yet." No name attached, but she didn't need one. She knew exactly who'd sent it, and the calm simplicity of it terrified her more than any outburst could have. Chris had always been most dangerous when he was calm. She showed Jae-young the message, watching him read it twice, his jaw tightening with a controlled fury she was learning to recognize as his version of fear. "We need actual security," he said finally, "not just watching from a distance. Real protection, around the house, around the daycare, around anywhere Ronnie goes until he's found." For the first time since this entire situation began, Nika didn't argue against outside help. Pride had no place left in a fight where her son's safety was the stake on the table. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay, do it." 2 days passed in a state of hyper-vigilant waiting, every knock at the door sending Nika's heart into her throat. Every unfamiliar car on the street logged and noted by the quiet security presence Jae-young had arranged without fanfare or spectacle. Exactly as he'd promised. Nothing flashy, just steady protection that let her breathe just slightly easier. On the 3rd day, police located Chris 2 states away, having used a friend's identification to rent a car and cross state lines. A violation serious enough to escalate the entire situation from a custody dispute into active criminal charges. He was arrested without incident, the calm confidence that had carried him through years of manipulation, finally catching up to consequences he could no longer charm his way out of. Nika sat in her mother's kitchen when she got the call confirming the arrest, and she didn't cry, didn't celebrate loudly, just closed her eyes and let out a long breath that felt like the first full exhale she'd taken in months, maybe years. "It's really over," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else in the room. "For this part," her mother said gently, echoing what Jae-young had said days earlier. "The important part is over. You're safe. Ronnie's safe. That's what matters most right now." The weeks that followed moved slower, gentler, the kind of pace Nika hadn't allowed herself to experience in longer than she could remember. Legal proceedings continued in the background, formal and procedural now instead of urgent and terrifying. The criminal charges against Chris ensuring a level of accountability she'd once believed impossible. Jae-young stayed in Atlanta through it all, not as a temporary visitor passing through her crisis, but as someone who'd quietly folded himself into the rhythm of her life without demanding space he hadn't earned. He learned Ronnie's favorite dinosaur facts badly and enthusiastically. He sat through cartoons he didn't understand with genuine patience. He never once tried to replace anything, never postured as a father figure before he'd earned that title through consistency rather than declaration. One evening, weeks later, sitting on her mother's back porch while Ronnie chased fireflies in the yard, Nika turned to Jae-young with a question she'd been holding on to for days. What happens now? You have a whole life in Seoul, a company, responsibilities I don't fully understand. He considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things. I have a life in Seoul, yes, but I don't have a version of that life I want without you in it. So we figure it out. Together. However that looks. That's a big thing to say. It's a true thing to say, he replied simply. I'm not interested in saying things just because they sound nice. She smiled, something warm and unguarded spreading through her chest. I know. That's kind of the whole problem. You ruined me for men who say pretty things they don't mean. Good, he said, a small satisfied smile tugging at his mouth. That was somewhat the plan. Ronnie's laughter drifted across the yard as he chased another firefly, and for a moment, the world felt impossibly light, impossibly simple. Two people who'd fought through fire, finally allowed a quiet evening to just exist in peace. But peace, Nika had learned the hard way, was never permanent, never guaranteed, and 3 weeks later, a call from Jae-young's family in Seoul would introduce a complication neither of them had prepared for, one that would test whether what they'd built could survive distance, family expectation, and a version of pressure that had nothing to do with Chris at all. The call came on a Tuesday morning, Jae-young's phone buzzing insistently while he stood in Nika's mother's kitchen making coffee he still hadn't learned to brew the way Americans liked it. He answered in Korean, his tone shifting immediately, formal in a way Nika had rarely heard him use, the easy warmth replaced by something careful and guarded. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the change in his posture, the way his shoulders squared, the way his jaw tightened around whatever news was being delivered on the other end of that call. When he hung up, he stood silent for a long moment before turning to her. Something unreadable in his expression. That was my mother, he said slowly. My grandfather is stepping back from overseeing certain family matters. There's an expectation, apparently, that I return to Seoul more permanently, to take on more direct responsibility. Soon, Nika felt something cold settle in her stomach. How soon? Weeks, not months. The words hung between them, heavier than either of them wanted to acknowledge out loud. She had just fought through a custody battle, just secured legal safety for her son on American soil, just begun rebuilding a life with roots finally starting to take hold. Seoul had been a place of escape, then healing, then unexpectedly, love. But permanently uprooting Ronnie's entire world again, after everything he'd already survived, wasn't a decision she could make lightly, no matter how deeply she'd come to feel about the man standing in front of her. I can't just pick up and move my son across the world again, she said quietly. Not right now. Maybe not for a long time. He needs stability. He needs to feel like the ground isn't going to shift under him every few months. I know, Jae-young said, and the pain in his voice told her he understood exactly what she meant, that he wasn't going to ask her to sacrifice her son's stability for his family's expectations. I'm not asking you to choose between us and him. I would never ask that. Then what happens? He didn't have an answer, not immediately, and the uncertainty of that silence sat heavier than any argument could have. For the first time since Seoul, since the noodle shop and the stolen groceries and the late-night conversations that had slowly built into something real, they were facing a problem that had nothing to do with Chris, nothing to do with danger or survival, and everything to do with the impossible logistics of two lives built on opposite sides of an ocean. That night, after Ronnie fell asleep, Nika sat outside on the porch alone, staring up at a sky that looked nothing like Seoul's, thinking about everything that had happened in the span of a few short months. She'd run from a man who nearly broke her, found unexpected safety in a stranger's front seat, built something real out of fear and rain and stubborn honesty, and now stood at the edge of a decision that had no easy answer, no clean resolution, no guaranteed happy ending waiting just around the corner. Jae-young found her there an hour later, sitting down beside her without a word, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers. I don't have a solution yet, he admitted quietly, but I know I'm not walking away from this. From you, from him. I just need time to figure out how to make it work without asking either of you to sacrifice what you've fought so hard to build. Nika leaned her head against his shoulder, the the same way she had in quieter moments back in Seoul, and let herself simply exist in the uncertainty instead of forcing it into an answer it wasn't ready to give. "We'll figure it out," she said softly, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it yet. "We always seem to, somehow." He turned his head slightly, pressing a soft, quiet kiss to the top of her head. Nothing more, nothing rushed, the kind of gesture that said everything neither of them had the answers to say out loud yet. 3 days later, a second phone call would arrive, this one from Seoul, carrying news that would change the entire shape of the decision in front of them. News about the very fiancé Jae-young had once lost. Information that had been buried for years and was about to resurface at the worst possible moment. Nika had no idea yet just how much the past was about to collide with the fragile future she'd only just begun building. That part of the story is coming in part 2. If you want to see how Nika and Jae-young handle what's coming next, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it, drop a comment telling me what you think that phone call is about, and I'll see you in the next one.